Let's talk about the Philadelphia 76ers, previewing the upcoming season for a team that is incredibly different to what they were last season. Michael Bolton, let's go.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and did you know that the Mona Lisa is much smaller than you think? Or maybe it's not. Maybe you think it's small. Then in that case, maybe it's bigger. I'm the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always, at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. All FanDuel customers right now from up until September the 22nd can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com right now to get started. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and we are available on all platforms. So we're starting the 30-team run through fantasy-wise for the NBA. For the fantasy basketball season, of course, that means the return of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Bowl. Your entry form for that is linked in the description below. The rules are linked in the description below. Roto leagues, head-to-head leagues, points leagues. You can enter one team into Roto, head-to-head, and points. You cannot enter multiple into each one. Fill out the entry form. You only need to do it once. You only need to fill out the entry form once. I'll have your name there, and we will go through the preferences that you list and try and accommodate everyone as best that we can. So, Locked On Fantasy Basketball Bowl back. Fill in those entries. They're there for you. Okay, so we're here to talk about the Philadelphia 76ers for this upcoming season. Again, like I just mentioned, this team is just very different to what they have been for last season. It's just, they made the moves. They decided they were foregoing cap space, or that they were accumulating cap space to make a big swing at things. They didn't extend Tyrese Maxey to keep that cap space open, and they did it. It worked. They made the moves they needed to make. They brought in players at max contracts, but below market deals in other areas, and they look pretty strong. So let's have a look at what I project their starting five to be. You've got Tyrese Maxey. Kelly Oubre, I think, is going to begin the season as the starting shooting guard. The new addition, Paul George, I would guess he is starting. I'm going to guess at the 3. Caleb Martin, who they brought across from Miami. He, I think, will be the starting 4, even though he's about 6 inches shorter than Paul George. Maybe he's 5 inches. He's not that big, but he played a lot of 4 in Miami. And then, of course, Joel Embiid at center. That is their projected starting 5. 3 locks, Maxey, George, and Embiid. And then Oubre and Martin. I'm pretty confident that they're going to be in that position. We'll talk about some risks to that later on, but I'm pretty confident they're going to be in that spot and that they're going to be sitting pretty decent enough roles at least we have to pay attention to them. So let's start by having a look. Now we've looked at those guys, looked at those players. We're going to go through all players as we go through this, don't worry. Let's start by taking a look at some undervalued fantasy options on the Philadelphia 76ers, and we'll start. The undervalued guy that we are going to look at is the player that did sign that max contract. I think there is a little bit of value sitting here at the moment with Paulie George. George on Yahoo has an ADP of 30. I think that's a little bit low. ESPN, I'm very certain it's low. He's ranked 34 for ESPN category leagues with an ADP of 44. And Paul George's ESPN points league ranking is even more obscene. It's 52. Now, Paul George is not as good in points leagues as he is in category leagues. So, yeah, that's what we've always got to pay attention to here. But I just think that there is just quite a bit of value sitting around for Yahoo category leagues and for ESPN points leagues based on that points league ranking. I think there is some value there in both of those scenarios, really. George was... Obviously, Paul George, he was really good last season. Like, he is 34, though, so there is, I guess, some concern there. He averaged 23, 5, and 3.5 assists. He shot 91 from the line. He hit over 3 threes a game. He gave you 1.5 steals. He gave you half a block. The big question's going to be on this team is that what happens to that 27% usage that he had last season? Because he was sharing the ball with James Harden and Kawhi Leonard. Now, Harden took a gigantic usage step backwards. So it's George and Leonard dominating the ball. I expect that Embiid reduces some of his sky-high usage from last season here in Philadelphia. But the question's going to be, do we see Tyrese Maxey keep the same level and George move into a third banana, James Harden, Bradley Beal level of usage? Does Maxey step back into the Harden-Beal mold and George maintains as the number 2? Or do both Maxey and George take significant steps backwards? It's obviously a question that we just don't know at this point. There is I don't know if the right term is, I guess it is undervaluing what Paul George or who he is as a player. He's really, really, really good. There are a lot of people who just immediately come in and go, yeah, well, Tyrese Maxey's their face of their franchise. He's going to step up and he was awesome breakout and George is just going to have to fit in. Whereas, honestly, like Paul George has gotten to way higher highs in his career than what Tyrese Maxey has. Obviously, George has been playing a lot longer and Maxey's only just started and that might switch. But I think at some points we underrate just how good Paul is. So I love that ESPN Points League has him at 52. I love that the ADP's got him at 44. I think that's all really good. That's tremendous value in those formats. Even the Yahoo ADP of 30, like Paul George could easily be a top 20 player, but he might not sit at that 27 usage. That might come down. That's possible too. The other one that I think is a little bit undervalued, and I don't want to just focus everything entirely on 12-team leagues, because deeper leagues are important. And Caleb Martin ranks at 201 on ESPN for category leagues, and his Fantrax ADP sits at 192. We're not looking at Caleb as this awesome, unbelievable option that's going to dominate and tear guys apart and all that sort of stuff. And his Yahoo, he doesn't have a Yahoo ADP, to be honest, and his Yahoo ranks at 167. I think 167 is reasonable. It puts him in the zone for 14-team leagues, and he will have streaming ability. And I don't know the exact number for this, but I would say during the course of an NBA season, we probably go... There's probably 250 players, I would guess, in a 12-team league that get rostered. So about half the NBA, maybe more. So the guys who sit here at this 170, 180 zone, well, we're not drafting them. We'll at least be aware of what they are and what they can do, and that's what we've got to pay some attention to. So I think Martin comes across and starts. Look, he might not, but I think he does. He's 29. He's only 6'5", but he played basically exclusively power forward last season. 27 minutes with 17 usage in Miami. 10 points with 1.3 threes. And part of his appeal 2 years ago in the playoffs was the three-point shooting. He just didn't take enough of those. But 4 rebounds and 2 assists. The steals and blocks aren't particularly good. He hit his good free throws. And nothing you see there looks awesome. The scoring's all right. The rebound's not bad. I would think there's a chance that he could push to 2 threes a game. Maybe the usage doesn't change, but just a different mix of shots. I think he could do that. There's also a chance he's a 1 steal per game player, which would improve his value. But if we're talking about where Caleb Martin sits, we're not getting super excited about it. But if we're in deeper leagues, I just think that, if you're not considering him in 14s and if you're not considering him in 16s, I think you're doing that wrong. But in 14-team leagues, there's got to be a little bit of something there, I think, that's available for Caleb Martin or a level of us being able to pay attention to it. What I do want to get into now is we talked about the value players, the undervalued players. I want to talk about the overvalued players. And I think this is a really great example of the way that sometimes in fantasy basketball we get a little bit into the wrong spot. Because I think in some situations, Paul George is overvalued. Now that sounds stupid because I just told you that I think he's undervalued. But it's all dependent, isn't it? Because Paul George, for a Yahoo Points League, has an ADP of 30. Well, that's not true. Because Paul George, Yahoo doesn't provide individual ADPs or individual ranks. So his ADP is 30. His Yahoo rank is 24. But for a Yahoo Points League, I think that is not the right value. I think that is going a little bit too high in a Points League format. So when we're talking about any of this sort of stuff and the valuations of players, like I'm not sure that Paul George is a good value pick in that spot. I think he might be like the 40th best player around that mark in a points league. And at 30, round 3, I don't know that I want to go there. At 24, I don't want to go there. So in a category league, I think he's way better. In a points league, I'm not convinced. So it's just going to be format dependent as to how we're valuing what Paul George brings. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Spoken about FanDuel so many times on this show because they've been with us for a long time and they're just great. And they're also, of course, America's #1 sportsbook. But we've got a new offer, a different offer to some of the stuff you would have heard from FanDuel before, because right now, every customer for the next week, up until September the 22nd, every customer who places a $5 bet gets a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With your YouTube TV base plan, you can get access to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market NFL game. All you need is a Google account, a valid form of payment. Of course, you can cancel that at any point. You've got under a week to take this offer up as well. Go to FanDuel.com right now and download America's #1 sportsbook, and don't forget to gamble responsibly. All right, so we talked about some overvalued guys. We talk about some undervalued players. That's the idea of doing this show. The next thing I do want to talk about here is looking at some breakout guys, and we just did the Nuggets show earlier today, and it was easier to sort of find that player who could be a breakout guy. And this one we're going to talk about here is not really super relevant for most leagues, but I think there's something for Ricky Council IV. Now, the mayor, whose family naming system is something that probably needs some investigation at some point by somebody because it's unbelievably wild, but that's okay. Council was a two-way player last season. He stepped it up towards the end. He found himself converted to a full-time contract, and the thing is that he can play that position that they're sort of lacking. They've got Caleb Martin, who's their 3/4. Honestly, Paul George should just play the 4, but he doesn't want to play the 4. It's too hard. So, the undersized guys will play that. They brought over Gershon Yabusele, who could play the 4 as well. But Council can play that role too. He's incredibly athletic. His shooting is a concern. But he's energetic. He dunks. He's a good usage guy. Like last season, he only played 9 minutes a game, but 22 usage. There's just something there for development for Council. I thought he played really well in Summer League as well this time around. So while I don't think that we're looking at Ricky Council as any sort of unbelievable fantasy guy, like if multiple injuries, like if Martin goes down and Paul George is out, I wouldn't be shocked to see Council ahead of a KJ Martin, who's probably going to get traded, and into a role that you go, Ricky Council, the shooting needs to be better, but he's just someone that I think that we just need to be at least keeping sort of our eye on it as to where he is or how they use him, because there is just that slight sliver of opening for him. Let's take a look at where we might see some risks in the rotation. I think there are 3 main things, or it's really 2, but I put it as 3. I think we saw this last season that once Kyle Lowry arrived in Philadelphia, that for some reason self-branded hat legend Nick Nurse loved him. Just wanted to play Kyle Lowry all the time. And in fact, he wanted to play him so much that he would start him next to Tyrese Maxey. Now, at the moment, I've got Kelly Oubre starting next to him, but we also saw Nurse move Oubre in and out of the lineup often. So, Lowry's an interesting one. Could he move into that position? Could he start? And now, that wouldn't mean that we'd be interested in drafting Kyle Lowry, but what it would mean is that impacts other players. His usage is in the toilet, 13 usage only, 8 points, 4 assists, and what he does turn into is a sort of slightly deeper league assists streamer, but then it has that downward effect. Does that take the ball out of Maxey's hand a little bit? It means that Oubre's role changes, but Oubre's usage might rise playing in off the bench versus starting. So I think that's a possibility. One of the other rotation risks is that maybe Caleb Martin at 6'5", 6'6" is too small to play at power forward. So does that mean that they have to go to, maybe it's Ricky Council, but after they brought him over after a really successful Olympic campaign, do they go with Gershon Yabusele in that spot? Yabusele played for Real Madrid last season. Of course, he was a first-round pick of the Celtics a few years ago. Didn't really do much in the NBA, but he's worked his three-point percentage up to a really usable number. And he's strong, he's tough, he defends pretty well. He's not a big defensive stats guy. And I don't think he'd be a 12-team league player, honestly. But there is just that potential, given the players who are playing in those spots, for Yabusele to be able to step into a bigger role and provide us with just a little bit more than we might expect. It's probably would only be deeper league sort of stuff that would happen, but it's something that we can't discount, I don't think, as an option of what might happen. And I think it is something just to be aware of, that there is, that those two spots, the Oubre / Lowry, the Martin / Yabusele / Council situation is a possibility to head that way. Let's go under the lens with Tyrese Maxey, who we were pretty excited about what he could bring last season. The problem was that we just didn't know how the James Harden, or when the James Harden situation would resolve. We didn't know when that would happen. But it did happen, and once it did happen, we started to see some really big stuff from Tyrese Maxey. Like, obviously, very, very impressive performances. The question here is like, he wins the most improved player, which I'm not hating on him at all, but did he deserve that, or did he just get more minutes or more usage? I'm not sure how much actually improved. But it is harder to do those things when you take on that larger role. His shooting was excellent. It did drop off somewhat, though. His offensive load went through the roof. It was so big, his load giggity, that's where you look at that and go, okay, he was subsisting on a massive load, massive creation, because not only did he ascend into being the number 2 player, but Embiid was out half the season, so he was the number 1 guy all season. So whatever your feelings about how much Embiid plays or not, you'd have to suggest that more than 39 games is likely. And then you add George over Harris. So there are people who think that Maxey's got another level in him. I'm not quite there on that. I think there is a risk of a step back from him. Just Harris versus George's ball handling, completely different. And that little graph on the side there, you can see just what percentage of plays Maxey ran as the pick and roll ball handler. That's that big spike. It's almost at 40%. Again, I'm not suggesting that he's not going to do that anymore, but when you introduce another player like Paul George, who runs that sometimes as well, definitely more than Tobias Harris, and you're introducing more, or theoretically, more Joel Embiid, there are some concerns that way. Now, Maxey's defense is obviously dreadful as well. He started out the season getting some defensive stats sort of weirdly, then they disappeared. Now, that is a problem, I guess, just from what is he as a player. Like, that defense is trash, and he can be better than that, but that doesn't impact us that much in fantasy. It's all about like how big that load and creation was. He's fine as a passer, but he's not awesome as a passer. So he really does need a lot of the ball in his hands to be able to generate stuff. And that's where we have to just watch where that value ends up. Like, what happens to him during the season. The numbers are great for Tyrese. 26 points, 6 assists, a steal, 45 and 87. He's 24. He also played 38 minutes a night with 28 usage. And while Nick Nurse is obviously a maniac, he could still play 38 a night, but what if that's 36? What if the usage is 26? What if the assists go to 5.6 or 5.4? Then I just think there are some risks associated with where Maxey is being, like, on ESPN, he's ranked 20th for category leagues. Feels way too high. Yahoo's getting drafted at 27. Okay? Bit high. My newer improved Durant formula actually knocks Maxey even further down in my list. So I looked at that and went, that's not ideal. In fact, I think he copped the second biggest hit out of the main sixes in terms of how that formula went, whereas George and Embiid rose up. So I looked at that and went, okay. I'm not out on Tyrese. I love Tyrese. I've been a big Tyrese guy from before he was drafted, from before he ascended into the point guard role and all that stuff. I've always been on team Tyrese. I'm always want to have that level of like, what is there more? Or does he sit at this level while they've got George there and it jumps when guys are injured, which is definitely possible as well. But I'm not certain that I look at what he did last season and go, well, he's awesome, he's young, he's 24, he won most improved, right? Next level on top of that. Because the next level on top of that is a 30 usage player with 8 assists, scoring 29 a game, and I do not think that's possible. Maybe it is, but I do not think that is going to be a likely scenario for Tyrese Maxey. So let's take a look at this graph I've got here from Basketball Index. You've got box creation on the y-axis. You've got 3-point pull-up field goals per 75 possessions, which is an indication, again, if you're taking pull-up threes, you're in command of an offense, right? You're doing a lot. Up the top of that graph, very far right corner is Tyrese Maxey. So his box creation is the highest of the three players that I've chosen here, and the three players I've chosen are Paul George and Tobias Harris and Tyrese Maxey. It's no surprise there that Maxey sits up top. He also takes the most pull-up threes out of that grouping. And you'll be not shocked at all to know that the box creation level of Tobias Harris to Tyrese Maxey is like Maxey's over double. You wouldn't be surprised to know that Tobias Harris is taking under 1 pull-up three-point attempt per game. Maxey's doing almost 5. And then the question is Paul George? Because Paul George's box creation sits at about 7, whereas Maxey's is about 8.7 or something. I think that's right. No, he's about 9 Maxey. Right? And Paul George is taking 3.8 pull-up threes per 75 versus Harris is 0.7. So, again, will Paul George assume the Tobias Harris role? No. He won't. Like, he will be Paul George, and he might still be less than Maxey in creation and pull-up threes. But he's still got to take the top off from somewhere. If you also look at the Darko DPM graph there for Maxey, like, consistent, the red line is a consistent improvement. He improved a lot. But look at last season, right? He took this wild leap at the beginning of last season, and then sort of midway through, he didn't crater, but he fell. The production dropped. And some of that is Embiid being out, but some of it also is this insanely hot run to begin the year, sort of just disappeared. And like he established himself, but it was a big spike, and then it was just a flattened number, which is fine. He was good. But it wasn't like a continual, it just keeps getting better and better and better. Maxey might end up going too early in fantasy drafts. And what I want to show you is my fantasy similarity. The players that are somewhat similar to him from a shape perspective, it doesn't necessarily mean volume. But I think these names would all make sense to you. Tyrese Maxey, Jamal Murray, Kobe White, Emmanuel Quickley, and D'Angelo Russell. Very similar players from a what they do perspective. So I guess the worry with Maxey somewhat to me is that like if that 38 minutes and 28 usage becomes 36 minutes, probably not. But what if the usage goes to 26 or 25? Does he then become Jamal Murray? Or does he become D'Angelo Russell? Again, probably not. Better shooters than those guys. But that's the sort of player that's the fantasy shape is similar. And we were overwhelmed with volume from Tyrese Maxey last season. And that is something that I'm not discounting it. I'm just saying I don't think we can guarantee that this season. Okay. So we've put Tyrese under the lens. I think it's time for us now to talk about injuries and injury concerns, injury updates. And I think it's relatively obvious where we're going to go with this one because I actually don't have any injury concerns with Paul George. He's not coming off any injury last season. I know he's missed time in the past, but there's no repeated things. Who we are talking about here, and the only guy that I really think is important for us to be discussing at this point, is the big fella, the man in the middle. It's Joel Embiid. And there are people who, I don't know if they try to think they're getting me in a gotcha moment or anything like that. It's possible that's what they're trying to do. I'm not sure. But they'll be like, Josh, I thought you told us don't draft based on someone's past injuries, which is also just not what I say. They go, well, how can you possibly justify not picking Embiid to pick 12 or pick 13? Because you always tell us you don't draft based on last season's injuries. Again, which is not exactly what I say. So for the complete clarity of the way that I approach injuries, which I think has been very, very consistent all the way through, is that when someone picks up multiple injuries, I have no issue with Joel Embiid when he breaks a finger, hurt his shoulder, fractured cheek because he ran into Markelle Fultz, sprained his ankle. I don't care. Paul George broke his leg. Yes? Paul George hurt his hamstring 5 years later. They're not related. I don't care about those injuries. What I have always said is the guys that I'm going to give a concern level to or a knockdown level to are the guys with a repeated injury in a lower body part. If you break your finger 3 times, I don't care. If you suffer a significant surgical injury on your knee, Kawhi Leonard, I do care. And guess what? Joel Embiid has now had 2 meniscus surgeries on the same knee. And I was trying to do some academic paper research on this. channeling my former life as a pharmacist, reading up journal articles. And what I could tell is that there is a massive rate of re-failure of meniscus injuries after surgery. Massive rate. I think it was a 36% re-injury rate on the meniscus. And he has had it done twice. That is why I don't want to... Joel Embiid might end up the number one player this season per game. I think it could be Wemby, could be Jokic, could be Shea, Doncic, whoever. I think Embiid's in that mix. And if we're just strictly judging off per game, he's a clear top 4, probably top 3 player. With Luka's 2-game playoff week, I would take Embiid over Luka. If we're just doing per game, I would do that. But we're not. And there are 2 players who fit this spot for me at the moment. It's Kawhi with multiple meniscus injuries in one knee with a torn ACL plus knee injury in the other knee. That I am out on that. And I am out on Embiid because we are talking about multiple meniscus injuries in the same knee. The risk of this reoccurring, of this being a continual problem, is very high. And that is the risk that I don't want. Someone gets a broken wrist, followed by a hamstring strain, followed by twisted ankle by standing on someone in the crowd. I don't care that meant they played 30 games. That I don't care. When you have multiple meniscus injuries, it's like if you tore your ACL twice, I'd be like, you know what? I'm not trusting that you're going to stay super healthy there. That is why I'm out on Embiid. And that is, I think, a relatively consistent, I think it's actually 100% consistent the way that I've approached this stuff. Is that I have been totally fine with drafting Embiid because I don't care that his face got crunched by Markelle Fultz. But I do care about this. The multiple torn meniscus one knee is a real problem to me. And that is why I would not take him until that final pick of the first round. That is why I would do that. Now you can, if you think there are inconsistencies in that logic, that's okay. To me, maybe my brain's twisted. To me, that is very straightforward, very, very consistent logic and principles that I've had around this for years and years and years that I've been doing it. And unfortunately now Embiid falls into that mix where I have to create a level of knockdown because of the recurrent same injury problem. That is a situation that does not get better. You don't regrow your meniscus. It is there like that. That is where the problem begins to lie, and it's where I start to become even more concerned maybe than others have been or I have been in the past. I hope that was... I don't know if illuminating is the right term, but I hope it's somewhat interesting for you to just hear me, again, just talk that through because I think it was important. Let's take a look now at the Philadelphia 76ers and their schedule coming up for the year. They have 54 quality games. That's on the high side. It's not the highest, but it's very high. So that's a bonus. So when you're considering Paul George and Tyrese Maxey or late flyers on Oubre or God forbid, Lowry or Martin or whatever you're doing, that's a good sign. The 15 back-to-backs is not the most. It's the second most. We don't love that, do we? So that's 15 we're basically wiping off Embiid. Puts him at 67 max. Going to be real hard for him to hit 65. Look, maybe he plays back-to-backs. Why that would happen, I have no idea. But maybe he does. They have 15 games with the maximum amount of games per week, which is the most in the NBA, so that's a benefit on their schedule as well. And their playoff schedule is really good. If you use my dates that end March 23rd, they go 4-4-4. If you push it back 1 week, they go 4-4-4. If you push it back to Yahoo's default, they go 4-4-3. And if you use ESPN's default, it's 4-4-3-4. So the playoff schedule is really strong as well. So there's a benefit there through the fantasy playoffs for the Philadelphia 76ers. Let's take a look at the young guys on this team. They are a team that skews very much older. So let's talk about the guys who are all under 23. There's 4 of them on this team. There is second-round pick Adem Bona. There's first-round pick Jared McCain. And there are two-way players undrafted, David Jones and Justin Edwards. Those numbers you can see if you're watching on YouTube are the numbers that come out from my Bazemore metric for dynasty values for a rebuilding team. I've got Adem Bona as a top 275 guy. McCain, I'm not really sure where he sits from a long-term dynasty perspective. The numbers for this year don't love him. So he's at top 225. And David Jones and Justin Edwards are outside the top 300. So there's nothing that's super exciting about any of those projections with those guys. But obviously the guy who is the first round pick TikTok legend, it is Jared McCain. Now, I just don't see where he's going to get these minutes under Nick Nurse because there is Maxey, there is Oubre, there is Lowry, and they signed Reggie Jackson. So I'm not really sure how much McCain is going to play. Those numbers you can see on the screen are his numbers from Duke. He's only 21 usage in college, which is a little low. He played 32 minutes a night and averaged only 1.9 assists, which as a point guard is not great. And now I think he's too small to play the two. So the McCain-Maxey backcourt, actually, that's really undersized. He shot really well, 41% from three. That didn't translate in Summer League, but I loved his aggression in Summer League. I think it's going to be a very rough season initially here for McCain, and it might even be rough 2 seasons. So I don't think we need to look at too much. And that's part of why that Bazemore number has him pushed down so low, is that there are a lot of things there that don't fully add up. The numbers don't always translate to fantasy, and I just think we're not going to get a lot out of him this season. Boner is the interesting one, who have probably got a better overall fantasy stat line than what McCain does. It's just a lot harder for me to see him being into a full-time role. Now, Andre Drummond, we're going to talk about him later. He's the backup center. Boner is probably the third-string center. I don't really know who else would be unless they play small with KJ Martin. But he is a guy, Boner, who's a undersized center. Actually, he's giving a lot Paul Reed. He's a very good defender. He's hugely athletic. I think there's maybe some semblances of an offensive game, but we're not there yet. But he's an interesting one to watch. David Jones and Justin Edwards, I don't really have any interest in those guys for any sort of long-term production or anything along that line. Risk versus reward. This is something that's based off a lot of the best case, worst case scenario work that I did and had a show for last week. But the guy that I think probably stands out to me for numerous factors, objective and subjective. Well, it's not really objective, but it's numbers-based versus vibes-based. But I think Paul George probably sits here as the risk-reward guy. I've got his best case, worst case category league variance is about 40 spots. Your best case, he's first-round player. Absolute best, probably not likely. His fantasy points variance is about 7.4 fantasy points per game, which is, again, a sizable amount. Now, Joel Embiid's variance for points leagues is about 8.5 per game. But because he's so high up, those higher up guys are going to have larger variance just through volume numbers. So I'm not including him as much there. But I think George probably fits the risk-reward profile the most. And we've talked quite a bit about Paul George, but that's the risk. Like, he could easily be a top 20 player. There's subjective risks about what the offensive role is, and he's 34. Like, is there a decline coming for him? That's also possible. So I think that he probably fits this this moniker really well. And then that brings us to talk about the over-the-hill players. And again, that term is used somewhat facetiously. But when a player hits the age of 29, they start to decline. The speed of decline depends. And there's a lot of guys on this team. 2 starters, Embiid and George. There's Andre Drummond. There's Kyle Lowry. There's Eric Gordon. There's Reggie Jackson. It's a lot of players. And Embiid put up ridiculous numbers last season at age 30. He was absolutely cranking. I would expect that Embiid actually pulls back a little bit this season. I've already said I wouldn't take him until pick 12 for injury reasons, not necessarily production reasons. George, to me, is like a back-end second-round player, but if you're letting him slide through to the third, I love that. Points league, not so much. Definitely let him slide even further, and then that's the big difference between those two. The one that is hard is not the right word, but one that requires a bit of nuance here is talking about the big avocado, Andre Drummond. Because obviously Drummond is back in Philadelphia for a second crack at things. He's put up strong numbers in the past. He's 31 now. He had 21 usage last season. He averaged 8 and 9 in just 17 minutes with 0.9 steals and 0.6 blocks. Obviously horrendous free throws. Solid enough field goals. You can look at my projections or anyone's projections for Drummond's numbers, and they will project him to play more minutes than he gets on a per night basis. Because you have to. Because we don't expect that Embiid's playing 82 games. So we know that Drummond is going to have games where he plays 28, 29, 30 minutes a night. We know that is going to happen. The problem with that is that we can look at Drummond's numbers and project them out and go, well, I've got him projected at 21 minutes a night. Right? Which by the end of the season might be what he does. But there'll be 20 games of 30 minutes and then there'll be 60 games of 14 minutes. And in the 60 games of 14 minutes, you can't use him in a standard 12-team league points or categories. That's not enough. He's not going to share this court with Joel Embiid. You're just not going to get enough out of him. And if you're in a daily changes format, holding someone who might be 200th waiting for Embiid to get injured, there's a real fine line about how long you can do that. Like if Embiid doesn't get injured in week 1 or week 2 or week 3, you're starting to go, I've got a dead roster spot here and I'm losing. But if you have him and you hold him and then Embiid goes down, knock on wood, he doesn't, opening night, well, you're laughing. Because the standard rosters allow no stashability. You can't handcuff, you can't stash. Because you need that roster spot. Because imagine you have him sitting there playing 14 minutes a night for 7 weeks. Then you get 3 guys injured and you got zeros on your bench as well. You're done. So it doesn't matter if he gets a run of 3 weeks at 30 minutes a night in the middle of January because you're not catching up. That's the conundrum with looking at rankings, and I will always go back to tell you this, is the way rankings are presented in general. They are presented to reflect the way that fantasy basketball started, season-long rotisserie leagues, which not many people play. Because season-long roto leagues, the overall average is fantastic to know that, because that matters. But in a head-to-head league, we want to know what you're doing game by game, week by week. And that's not reflected in averages that well. So that is, again, a point that I am going to bang on about a lot. You've got Kyle Lowry on this list as one of the older guys. He's 38. Like, the decline has already happened. And then there's Eric Gordon and there is Reggie Jackson. Both of these guys are going to be playing sizable-ish roles coming off the bench for this squad. And that's probably another reason why I have some concern about someone like a Kelly Oubre, because Oubre is one of those players who scores and doesn't do anything else, really. Eric Gordon can shoot, usually better than Oubre. He's probably a better passer. He's obviously old as well. He's 36. But he joins this team, just adding extra depth through those backcourt positions. So him and Reggie Jackson, that's why we think McCain's not really going to play. But it just adds extra pressure onto that Oubre minutes. Like if Oubre's... And we'll talk about it. Well, actually, might as well just talk about Kelly Oubre now, because he's one of those ones that people do like often a lot more than I do. And there is a reason that I'm down on what he is. Last season, Oubre played only 30 minutes a night, despite all the injuries. He had 22 usage. He averaged 15 points. 1.1 steals is nice, but only 1.5 threes. He never gets assists. He doesn't block shots, really, although 0.7 is not bad. His free throws were subpar. He's just one of those guys that appears like he's doing more, but I just don't think that he is. I don't think that Kelly Oubre is necessarily a draftable player, and I'm actually pretty glad to see that most people are agreeing. Now, on ESPN, he's got an ADP of 133, which is not where I would be looking at him. Yahoo's got him at 165, and even though he's going to start, and we like to prioritize starters and minutes, I don't think that Oubre is going to be a player that we need to be paying really any attention to at all. So he will be someone that we stream in when players are down and opportunities open up. And we know that this is where he thrives. When Paul George and Embiid miss a game together, Oubre will start. He'll get more touches. He'll be inefficient. He'll get 1 assist in 3 games combined. But then he'll go back and play 27 minutes or 28 minutes and the shots will disappear and he'll sort of float around and do nothing. So with the addition of Gordon, with Lowry, with Jackson, Maxey, there's so many other guys there that I don't think we're going to be getting huge stuff this season out of Kelly Oubre. So I think that about covers us for the Sixers. Talked about Embiid, talked about Paul George and Tyrese Maxey in depth, and why I think that there's a chance that George is underrated, Maxey's overrated, but also George might see a huge slash in usage. He might get Bradley Beal. Possible too, and that's a risky thing. Caleb Martin starting, Gershon Yabusele, breakout potential of Ricky Council, the old guards in Gordon and Jackson. You've got Jeff Doughton as a 2A guy who's somewhat interesting, although he is older. KJ Martin, who's almost definitely being traded. I think that covers stuff for us here. Hit the thumb on the way out. Leave your comments on the Sixers down below. I think we're going to be doing the Washington Wizards as the next one of these team preview shows, so be on the lookout for that, guys. We are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Sign up for Locked On Fantasy Basketball. See ya.